It's great, Emily and Priscilla and Carl, for all of the support and for everyone on the call taking time out from their busy day. It's great to see everyone. Yeah, we're going to be talking today about our journey, combination of sort of like an audit, a therapy session, team building exercise, through the CoreTrustSeal certification process. And I'm really glad to have Shahira with me. She has very generously dedicated her time to this session today, even though she is on sabbatical and will be joining us back again. So thanks, Shahira, for popping on. And you'll see my name is in the lower right corner there. Don't be confused. We put these on so we know Shahira and I each know which slide we're going to be talking about. So I'll Shahira, just let me know when you're ready to forward things when it's your turn, and we'll just get going.
Sounds good. Nice to see everyone, and nice to see such a high turnout. It's great to be here. Yeah, so a bit of a background. Corey and I first discussed applying for CoreTrustSeal certification when Endrio Portage, now the Alliance, announced this little funding package to entice different repositories across the country who are interested in going up for CoreTrustSeal certification to kind of apply together as a cohort. So they actually footed the funding application fee, which is very appreciated. And then Scholars Portal brought together a bit of a cohort as well to work through some of the application details, right? And so they held regular meetings that brought us together with a few other different Borealis members to kind of work through that application, which is quite an extensive application, as you will find out through our talk. Just to kind of talk about, what the certification requirements met in the context of the Borealis model, which is quite a unique model, and there's some intricacies there. I think it was actually Corey that attended most of those meetings. So is there anything you wanted to add there, Corey?
No, it's just it was a huge help having a cohort and having some funding.
Yeah, many thanks. All right, next slide.
Okay, about CoreTrustSeal. Let's go over my notes here. It's as it says here, it's an international certification standard, and there's 16 kind of core requirements. I would encourage people just to take a quick look at their website, and it goes through all of the various sections that you'll have to deal with, everything from having a clearly defined mission and scope for your repository, what your organizational infrastructure looks like, what your expert guidance is, and so that's sort of the governance piece. And then there's the managing the digital objects. So things like integrity, maintaining authenticity. The preservation plan is a really key piece. And for a lot of folks, that can be quite a significant stumbling block. And then, the technology piece around the infrastructure and the security. And because this was a sort of a shared responsibility thing through Borealis with Scholars Portal, some of that got a little bit complicated, but it was still a great experience. It's a peer review process, so we can talk about that a little bit. But the evaluators are folks from other certified repositories. It's recognized fairly widely globally, and it does a good job of supporting fair data principles, as most of you will be familiar with that. Sorry, just clicking here. Chihira.
Yeah, one more thing I'll add, I guess, to that peer review piece too, is that one thing that appealed to us is that it is like a community maintained standard. The CoreTrustSeal arose out of a Research Data Alliance working group and is still maintained by an RDA group. So I think that really appealed to us. If you want to go to the next slide, Corey, about why we were interested in pursuing certification. That sort of model really appealed to us. So some other reasons, most importantly is I think it's a useful tool to communicate, trust to your, audience. So in our case, both the researchers who are depositing their data with us, but also the administrators at our institution, funding us, promoting us. It's great to be able to point to, as cheesy as it might be, like a logo and be like, we're good, we're trusted. It's actually really helpful as a communication tool. We also hoped that it would help us communicate, I guess, trust and authority even to funders and publishers. So of course, there's the tri-agency RDM policy, and that data deposit piece is going to be rolling out in the next few years, likely. But also more and more, publishers list, trusted, authoritative repositories as places that they recommend that researchers deposit their data in their data policies. And unfortunately, not too many of them list Borealis. So getting ourselves on there, I think, is a priority for us, and hopefully CoreTrustSeal certification will help with that. Internal motivation too, the work of going through the application just forces you to reflect on your own practices, your own policies, your documentation, which at the time that we started the application was much more scant than it is now having completed the application. So some sort of self-improvement too. Demonstrate accountability to actually kind of, get that institutional buy-in. We submitted this application. We have the sort of sign off from our university librarian saying that we're committed to keeping the data that we receive. We're a trusted repository. That's important for the library to kind of stand behind. And then, stand out among the crowd of, 60 plus other Borealis repositories. It's nice to be the first at things. So happy to kind of jump in there first and yeah, shine a little bit and bring attention to Borealis as well as a really fantastic service model for a national repository.
Yeah, it's sort of like a friendly competition, sort of like the
Yeah,
Flames and the Oilers kind of thing. Who won?
or sends, Corey sends.
Oh, right. Yeah. I guess that's going to start next week, which
Yeah.
is exciting. I would also just, yeah, add to what Shahira is saying. I think the internal piece was, I guess it is really, really good to stand out in that shared environment and to demonstrate that stuff externally to people. But that internally, the work that you need to do to get all your ducks in a row is super critical. And it also helps people from across the library understand what you're doing, which is really cool. Sometimes annoying for them, but it's also really important for them to see what we're doing. So I'll just move on to the next one. Okay. So the application process was, so yeah, you start with the light bulb and with the party there, and that took a long time. So I'll step through this and maybe hit the pain points so people can understand if you're going to be doing this at your own institution, what this might feel like. Again, joining the cohort was amazing because we had funding to hire a student, and the student worked in the archives. They were conversant with a lot of the digital preservation piece, and they were able to basically step through all of the requirements for the documentation that we needed and gather what we had together and then determine what more we needed, which was a huge thing to have someone just go off and do that. The support we got from the cohort was amazing. Scholars Portal has a wiki with lots of documentation, lots of examples, and really helped get us oriented initially to what we needed to do with this type of thing. And I'll just say, like, CoreTrustSeal it can be quite intimidating at first, but it is considered fairly lightweight, fairly affordable, and fairly accessible compared to something like Track, which is based on more complex ISO standards. So having that support was really great. So then we started working on the policy and documentation gaps. And again, so I'm a dedicated digital preservation librarian with lots of other stuff to do, and Shahira, same with data curation with lots of other stuff to do. But I think because we had two dedicated positions within our organization, it made the work proceed maybe a little bit more better, if I could put it that way, than a lot of organizations where there isn't the dedicated personnel. But that's not to say that it isn't possible. It's just that you need to be realistic about the amount of time it would take and look for funding opportunities to bring students in to help or others in to help. We submitted our application with lots of help and guidance from Scholars Portal because it's a shared infrastructure. and again, I can't say enough of how good Scholars Portal, how smart they are there, and how much support they're able to provide. It took a long time once we submitted it to get the feedback. Do you remember this time, Shahira, where it's like, what the, where are you guys? What's going on here? Um, and then it was sort of, I don't know. I'll try to be like I can see Shahira smiling. I am too.
Being recorded, Corey.
I know. So how it worked for us, it was basically we got a bunch of feedback. We changed things based on that feedback, and then it went to the second round. But the second round was sort of like it felt like it was a whole new process. It wasn't necessarily looking at what we had done. It felt like it was new reviewers looking at things again. So we had a bunch of other stuff to deal with that wasn't picked up in the first round, and we were just sort of wondering like when does this end, etc. But it did. And so it took, once we submitted things, like it took a year for over, like close to a year or at least a year for that review process to happen. So it was quite slow. And I think they were going through a transition to a new model at CoreTrustSeal, et cetera, et cetera. But just prepare yourself to wait once you've submitted things, and then prepare yourself to have to rethink things a couple times. And then we achieved certification. Did you hear anything to?
No, that was very diplomatically put. The peer, I mean, any peer review process can be, you know, uh, difficult, interesting, and you never really know what goes on behind the scenes. But I think in the end, it was quite a rigorous peer review process, right? We got a
Yeah.
lot of comments, so it did help the application, even though it could have, it's a little frustrating at times.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about how CoreTrustSeal influenced our data curation and what were some of the opportunities that resulted and challenges. So, um, CoreTrustSeal doesn't really ask you, like, so I guess going into the CoreTrustSeal process, I kind of had this idea that they would like be like, oh, this is, you're doing a good job of curation or a bad job of curation. But, because it's such a, they invite many different repository models to apply for certification. They don't really get into that sort of operational detail. They do ask for a lot of documentation. So regardless of whether you're a repository that does kind of basic curation, whether you're just like, checking files and adding like really basic metadata through to more like data level curation where you're actually like editing deposited data, which some, disciplinary repositories do. There's that whole scope of like of curation models can achieve CoreTrustSeal certification. So what they're really asking for is clear documentation and clear adherence to standards where they exist, and then documentation of those standards too. So a lot of documentation. And so at the time that we applied, we had guidance for depositors and some sort of basic requirements, that like, files must be named well, that there needs to be sufficient metadata, like pretty, I would say, basic curation, but not much else other than that sort of guidance to depositors. So we really had to kind of create new documentation that explained our workflows, right? Like, what does the deposit process look like? What do we review in terms of like, yeah, reviewing it and augmenting a data set. And we got a lot of help or had a great template to fall on from McMaster University. I don't know if anyone from McMaster is on the call, but Danica at the time had shared with me a really fantastic rubric that they used. And so we kind of built off of that. And so creating a whole bunch of documentation that explained that workflow that was kind of transparent around what were the requirements we were reviewing, kind of explaining that sort of iterative process that happens when you send a data set back for modification or things like that. And it was an opportunity to really kind of reflect on all of the value add that we bring to the deposit process, actually. And that's great to be able to think through and be able to communicate in the application, but also we've since been able to share that broadly in other venues. Challenges, yeah, like there is no kind of minimum level of curation, so you do need to define for your own repository what counts for you, and then document it. And that required kind of balancing, like a balancing act, right? Every institution only has so much capacity. So really, like, what are we looking for in a data set, and what meets like our standards for long-term preservation? Like, what are we willing to accept into our collection over time? What's the minimum quality? Has to take into consideration who you have to do the curation. And since we've applied for certification, we've brought in more librarians to do curation work, which has been fantastic. But it's still a challenge to balance. And then it's, a challenge, but also say an opportunity. I think going through this process has allowed us to think through what a scalable model for curation looks like, where we have a lot more like liaisons doing curation and developing subject expertise for data sets. So that's a challenge, and that you need to provide that additional training, but it's certainly an opportunity, and that you're able to do more and bring more people into this fantastic work. Next.
Right. Sorry.
Unless you have anything to add, Corey.
No, that's good. I don't know anything about data curation, so I won't add anything. But I will add something on digital preservation. This is a piece that I should say, first of all, like as Shahira and I talk about this stuff, if anyone is sort of feeling overwhelmed or intimidated by the process, I wouldn't. It's something that you can step through, and I won't speak for Shahira, but for myself, I'm more than happy to have more conversations with folks if they need any support, if they feel like we might be able to provide that for them. But the one of the bigger challenging pieces is the digital preservation requirements. This might be a piece where people get a little bit hung up because it's not quite clear, but I don't think because it was sort of different depending on the reviewer, but what Scholars Portal does with the Ontario Libraries Research Cloud and the underlying infrastructure, the kind of bit level preservation that's provided through the repository itself, isn't enough to meet the requirements for the digital preservation piece here. And so what you basically need to do based on, the best practices in digital preservation is you have to get like you have to kind of export your stuff out of the access repository and put it somewhere safe, separate from it is the idea. So what that looked like for us was initially experimenting with an Archivematica integration, because there is that ability, but there are some technical issues with how that integration works, and it breaks down in some cases. And so we weren't able to move forward with that. And so what we settled on was Scholars Portal every 6 months or every year, and we haven't settled on it yet, basically provides us with exported copies of all our data through it like a Baget. Export bag is like a standard packaging protocol for schlepping stuff around between repositories and preservation systems. And so we get those bags, we process them through Archivematica, and then we store them on our preservation. So we use our preservation infrastructure to manage that stuff, and we can do things like format identification and manage that stuff over time. So that was the big challenge, was getting all of that piece into place and then documenting it all and making sure that that documentation was publicly available. But again, it did really help to strengthen our policy development there. It wasn't like, this is something that can be done, and the more people that sort of ask for it from Borealis, the more accessible it will become for others as well. And the Borealis team has documented their preservation responsibilities online, which is really great. And then we document ours. And so getting the roles really clear was a piece we had to work on. And again, we can help folks articulate that because we have examples on both sides. You can see what a successful application looks like. I don't know if it boosted the awareness of preservation needs across life. I mean, you'd like to think that having these conversations does that, but it definitely gets the message out there more. There is limited control over infrastructure in a consortial environment, but it's not a huge problem because again, we get those sort of detangled archival information packages, those bags, and we're able to deal with them there. And we're still kind of formalizing what that looks like because it's a really fluid situation right now with Archivematica and our storage and digital asset management system for our preservation needs. So it's not like you have to have something really fixed in place when you're doing the application. Don't feel like you have to solve every problem in the world. In many cases, you just have to articulate how you're going about addressing the challenge. And that's what I felt with preservation. So, Shahira, anything to add to that?
Only that, so Megan put in the chat the Borealis preservation plan. So then I threw in the action plan you created for UVic. And I think in terms of the reviewer feedback, I think this is the area that really it helped the most in that, like, they really wanted to see like clearly what levels of preservation you were applying to the data sets. And so it turned what may have been more of like a not wishy-washy, but like, more influx process where we were experimenting with, by we, I mean, Corey was experimenting with different things into like a concrete workflow, which is fantastic.
Yeah, and it was again, Scholars Portal was really open to
Yes.
doing that just for us, right? At this point, what's giving us those bags, so that was really great.
Yeah, can only further emphasize how fantastic it is to work with Scholars Portal and just how much like they were open to like us figuring out different ways and workflows. They were super great to work with. Okay, so then lastly, other opportunities and challenges in terms of governance. They do have a requirement that there's some kind of like internal advisory group. And so what we did, it was an opportunity for us to create a local Dataverse advisory group within our kind of library working group structure. So it's a part of our open scholarship working group that's chaired by our head of open scholarship. So it's great to kind of make that tie into to see data, like research data as part of that broader open scholarship role that the library has. But on the advisory group, we also bring in folks outside of the library. So there's representation from research computing. There's folks from different, like researchers from different research groups. There's data curators from large groups on campus like Ocean Networks Canada. So it's kind of a cross-sectional group of really smart people that we meet maybe 3 times a year just to, share updates about Dataverse. Also talk about like increasing awareness on campus and use of Borealis and Dataverse. So that was one great thing that resulted. It allowed us to clarify roles and responsibilities internally. There's gray area between what's curation and preservation and what's the role of liaisons and bringing researchers to the platform as well. How does this tie into open scholarship, like I said? So it's helped in some ways there too. And then, there's an explicit, we've promoted now that we have CoreTrustSeal for certification. I think our UL has really kind of pushed that out there too. We had some great support from comms just to raise awareness of this, achievement. And so now we got to, back that up with financial support. So it's kind of reciprocal. Challenges in terms of governance. One part of the application that they really kind of emphasized, and we had quite a few back and forths around with them on, was that they were really looking for like clear governance of like metadata standards and like wanted to know like what controlled vocabularies you were using and like did those have community support? And we're such a generalist repository that like all we really have in terms of standard is that like standard set of metadata. Anyway, so we don't typically use, or we use some controlled vocabularies and like in the metadata where they exist, but like we're not monitoring them. So that's where like, that sort of peer review process is kind of like sometimes you're like speaking different, not different languages, but you're not really sure it's all written feedback, right? So you're not really sure what they're getting at and whether they're understanding what you're getting at. Anyway, so that was one piece that was kind of tricky. And then also just the Borealis being a unique service model, they wanted like a clear understanding of like what is UVic responsible for versus what is Borealis responsible for, what's U of T's financial commitment to Borealis, what's UVic's financial commitment to being part of this model, and then what would we do in the instance of like us not being a part of Borealis, what would happen to all this data and what sort of financial support do we have for that sort of like disaster mitigation recovery type piece. So like, again, had to work closely with Borealis to understand what they're doing, what we're doing, who's responsible for what, which in the end was quite helpful. And in the end was satisfactory for reviewers.
Yeah, I was gonna say too, like, because we've done this and sorted it out, and because there's a successful document that folks can look at, those types of shared services for even things like Scalaris or Borealis will be easier in the future because we'll be able to point to something that has already been done in that same infrastructure. So, right, collaboration with Scholars Portal. Again, as we've emphasized, it's been really, really wonderful. And being able to fill in so much of the technical side of the application with knowing that it's on world-class infrastructure was really great. And also Scholars Portal and the Borealis community as sort of a portal into all of this expertise and technical support that we needed was wonderful. And the fact that Scholars Portal is so good about documentation and putting that online was super, super helpful. And like Shahira said, a lot of what we worked on was clarifying for the reviewers how shared responsibilities work. Certification standards tend not to do very well with these kind of split responsibilities. And so that took quite a bit of work. And again, when you look at the document, you can see how we articulated that. So the only sort of local needs within the consortium model was really around the digital preservation. And again, if you look at the Borealis preservation documentation, they're very clear that they're able to support people by providing copies of their of your data to process through a preservation system that you might have locally. So overall, extremely positive experience working with those folks.
I think we touched on a lot of these throughout the sections, but some like more immediate outcomes, you know, getting that shiny badge actually does help uh, in terms of like that sort of institutional awareness piece. You know, it's something that we now can take to different faculty meetings and be like, hey, did you know we're CoreTrustSeal certified? And they're like, what's that? And I'm like, let me tell you, it's this, you know, we're so great. Deposit your data with us. So that's actually like surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, if you're a comps person, like actually a really useful like benefit. Just that shiny badge, people like that. And then obviously like just improved clarity. So like at the time that we were going through this certification process, we were also moving our curation process to like a ticketing system. I didn't touch on that. So now we use like LibAnswers queues to like handle incoming data sets and share that curation responsibility among different curators. So like it's resulted in a much more kind of robust curation practice, which is great. Cleared some holes in our workflows, particularly on preservation. I think we have much more of like a internal team approach to Borealis, which is great. And obviously more recognition from the library executive and the Office of Research Services too, for Borealis being where researchers should put their data if they are at UVic. And then long-term benefits, hopefully it results in more researcher confidence in our repository. Like obviously we still have lots of researchers depositing data to disciplinary repositories, Dryad as well. Hopefully we can get some inroads into getting publishers to point to us as well as those other places researchers are depositing data. Hopefully we'll see what comes up from the deposit piece of the funding requirements and what they were looking for in terms of a quote unquote repository, but having CoreTrustSeal certification hopefully means that we're good. And yeah, hopefully just outside of just the research data piece, hopefully it shines some light on all of the amazing work that goes on in the library to steward not just research data that goes into a capital R data repository, but all the types of data, whether they're manuscripts, digital objects, all that sort of like work that the library does as a whole in stewarding those materials.
Awesome. Reflections, recommendations. You can see here, it's a, so I don't know, I would kind of phrase this in two things come to mind after I did these slides. The first one is the world is not necessarily getting any safer, and I don't think Canada necessarily gets a free pass from some of the things we're seeing happening with data in other jurisdictions. And so this process is going to help you anticipate a lot of the challenges that might come at a time like that. So I think it's more than ever important to get for all of our data services, making sure that our ducks are in a row and that it's a robust service with appropriate replication so it can survive some of those larger geopolitical risks if they ever do come about. And it's a really amazing way to basically just reflect on your practices and fill any gaps and make friends while you're doing it. And the recommendations I would have start, and I'm sure Shahira would echo this, is start as early as you can. Don't expect this to be done over a summer or even a year. Involve as many people as you can. Don't get too unwieldy, obviously. Um, and think of it as not necessarily about getting the ribbon at the end, which is really fun, get the shiny badge, but as a way to really reflect and refine your own processes. The other thing I'll say is when Chihiro and I started this, there was no like Chat GPT 4.0. It would be so much easier now to do some of this stuff in terms of just the ability to really quickly say, like, do a Python script or figure out how you're going to schlep data around with minimum coding expertise. So I think that the use of large language models will make this type of process quite a bit more accessible to smaller institutions that might not have dedicated programming staff, etc. And also just to get all of those words on paper is a lot of work, and to develop that documentation. So using something like ChatGPT or Claude to get a first draft in place will put you ahead quite substantially. And we weren't able to take advantage of that. But yeah, so I think that's what's the Q&A.
Yeah, so happy to answer any questions now, or if you start the process and want to reach out, feel free to contact Corey or myself, and we'd both be really happy to help however we can.
Thank you both so much. This is super great. I'm just going to start going through some of the questions in the doc, but feel free to keep adding them, folks, as we go, and we'll do our best to get as many in as we can. So the first one that I wanted to ask is, I think it would be really helpful for the larger repository folks to know sort of like, do you have plans for like UVic space along these lines? Like why or why not? Like how does this apply or not to like an institutional repository as a process? And yes, it was in French. I was just translating,
That's great.
hopefully well enough.
Chihiro, do you want me to?
Yeah, tackle. If you want to start, that's good with me.
We are probably not going to pursue that, but it's really interesting because I think we're going to be in a similar situation where we are looking at transitioning from a locally hosted DSpace to Scalaris. And so maybe we'll just copy and paste our existing CoreTrustSeal certification, replace Borealis was cool. I don't know. We haven't actually, it's funny because it's sort of a different side of the shop at our institution, and the folks that head up the institutional repository um, haven't necessarily been talking about that, but it is something that we should probably explore.
And it's something that's come up in like talking about CoreTrustSeal to just other folks who are knowledgeable about like institutional repositories or other types of repositories, like trusted digital repository, like TDR status. How does it differ or compare? That would be something to explore, but we have not yet done that. So how does CoreTrustSeal compare to other sorts of, measures of trust would be, I think, a useful exercise. Good question.
Maybe a related questions that are a little later on the list is, do you have any aspirations to store any of your other Archivematica content, like certified through CoreTrustSeal? Or maybe how does CoreTrustSeal compare to the track certification you mentioned? Like, does this left you feeling like you're done with what you've done so far, or is there like a bigger picture you're looking at?
That's probably a better question for Corey, but maybe Corey, you could talk about the like preservation framework you've created.
Yeah, I think it's it's really challenging, and without getting into the nitty-gritty of how the open archival information system works, we have all of these different sort of access repositories and platforms like DSpace, Dataverse, Vault, which is our sort of digital like uh, Fedora-based repository, Archive it even for web archiving, and then we have our digital preservation system. And so there's all these different components, and I can't see how you would be able to certify all of that overall. I think it's a similar way maybe, and I'll show my naivete when I say this, but in the way that Scholars Portal doesn't have its entire infrastructure certified, it's just for the journals. And so I don't know how that certification would work overall because it's such a complex, diverse, fluid environment, the repositories and preservation systems connecting and how that all works. And so I don't think so. And that's one of the kind of the issues here is that you're kind of in an environment like a research library where you aren't just that repository. There's so many other things. I'm not sure how much that would make sense to pursue an overall certification. It'd be so much work and so complicated.
Did you want to say anything about the Trustworthy Repositories audit and certification process? I don't.
Oh yeah. If there's anyone from University of Alberta on the call or from Scholars Portal that has had experience, I know that U of A like years ago was thinking of that. It's a massive undertaking and very expensive and beyond our capacity for sure. But I could see that potentially happening for, say, Borealis at scale or Scalaris at scale or CRKN. CRKN is another example of a track certified repository. You'd have to do it sort of at that scale. An individual institution like UVic doesn't have the capacity to do that. It costs so much money and time.
That makes a lot of sense, though, and so many of the processes are the same. Doing this kind of stuff at a consortial level is probably a good way to do it. We had a question about how you're going about promoting or educating your users, researchers, admin on the pros of the certification. You talked about this a little bit, but is there anything you wanted to add in terms of how it's affecting that side of things?
Well, we wrote like a little like news release that ended up being shared quite like widely. So it's just posted to the library's website, but then like it got posted in like the Office of Research Services has their kind of like monthly newsletter, and then it got posted in the campus news like checklist that gets sent around weekly. So that's been actually really useful for promotion. Like I think we've been running Borealis or UVic Dataverse as a repository for I don't know, like 6 years now. So like people know about it, but you forget about it. So it's just another way to kind of surface attention, which is helpful. Um, and then like we've taken it on ourselves to like approach like departments or faculty meetings and be like, hey, did you know that we're now CoreTrustSeal certified? And they're interested in that. It's a nice title, right? So I think that opens a few more doors. So it's, like anything promotion-wise, kind of incremental, but yeah, it's just, some top-down, bottom-up approaches.
Yes, any excuse to remind people that we exist for sure. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I wanted to add, so there's a question about if there are resources you use to develop your plan. I've already copied over. There was the Scholars Portal docs with the Dataverse CTS certification project, the Borealis preservation plan, and then the UVic plan. Is there anything else you wanted to highlight as a resource folks should be aware of?
Just those the documentation that Scholars Portal did was where we started. That was awesome. And then looking at all of the other applications. And again, this is where like putting all of those into Notebook LM and say, like, give me an average of what that section might be, you know? So like there's ways that you
That
wouldn't
would be nice.
there's ways that you wouldn't need to read 100 successful applications now that would make that easier. But
Mhm.
yeah, like the Scholars Portal documentation and the stuff from the actual CoreTrustSeal website, the successful repositories that were similar, like kind of Dataverse-y, generalist-y kind of thing. That's what I looked at.
Yeah, I'll also say, so not necessarily for the preservation piece, but for the other like more curation pieces. I don't know if anyone, I'm sure I see many people on the call here that overlap with the Borealis like admin community. Um, yeah, like there's been over the years so many great, like we've learned from our peers in that group over time too. And so all of their workflows or their documentation, like I mentioned, McMaster's, but there are many other examples that we've like learned from or like taken pieces from and brought into our own workflows over time. So that community as a whole is such a valuable resource and for sure has helped us in achieving this in many different ways. So they have lots of other, like, yeah, that group could be another group to turn to for like, if we could build, I don't know if Borealis might already have it, like a library of different like materials that people are using in administering their repository. That could be a useful resource to either create or turn to.
Great, thank you. And I'll note that Megan Goodchild just shared some draft documentation in the chat there too, if folks want to check that out. We had a question, have reviewers asked for evidence in terms of data sets published in the repository to see if those had been curated according to the policies? I'm not
Yeah,
totally, yeah,
I
okay.
saw that question and I thought, oh, that's so interesting. And no, they didn't. So it's a bit of like, what's the right word? Like they're trusting that you're not just making it all up, right? Like they're not auditing your repository to see that you're following your policies. I think that would be a bit extreme, but useful. Like I would actually, that's what I was kind of hoping for as part of this process,
Yeah,
is for someone to critique like how well I'm curating data sets. Like that sort of like criticism is helpful.
make sure you actually
Um,
did it.
yeah, or like that, like give feedback, like, oh, you should be like, adhering to this standard. Like, that if they don't go into the operational piece, um, it's a bit, it's more like they trust that if you're sharing the documentation that you're following it as best you can.
That's interesting to know and good to be aware of as far as the possible gaps there between
Yeah, there's no like
documentation and
CoreTrustSeal police
practice.
be like, whoa, 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 you guys didn't upload a README file with the right formatting last data set. Like no one does
For
that.
sure. We had a question in the chat a few minutes ago. What did you need programming for in the application process? I know there was reference to some like, moving bagged packages around. Maybe that's the main thing, but if there's other things you want to mention too,
Oh, I
maybe
was just
specifically for applying. Yeah.
yeah, no, you don't need that for applying. You're just writing things out. But if you're smaller and under-resourced in terms of how you deal with the data once you get it from Scholars Portal, if you even need to do that, because it might be that you could work with Scholars Portal on some sort of, thing around that. But I think it's much more accessible to, process that data, store it. It's a lot easier with the kind of tools that are available now to help create code for that. I have to go to my developer for that stuff. But a lot of the really simple stuff I can do myself now because of the coding help that you can get from things like ChatGPT. That's all I meant by that. It just the sort of like documentation and data like schlepping around is just it's becoming more accessible because of the tools that are available out there, I think. So it's going to be easier for folks that start now than it was for us, and that's all I meant by that.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. We got another question here in the chat. Although it might be too early to tell, have you noticed increased deposit numbers or any different kind of deposit types since certifications? Maybe more broadly, like how are you sort of evaluating responses to this?
Yeah, it's tough to say, like, to attribute causality.
Yeah.
But like our deposit rate like has like increased many times over in the last year. So not necessarily since certification, but for sure since we've had better workflows and had more curators doing the work. Like I think the work of improving I'll say the work of improving our workflows and repository as a whole has led to more deposits for sure. So I don't think it's just the certification, but the more robust practices, I think for sure, many times over has increased our deposit rate. Like I think we went from a few hundred being deposited over a few years to like, I don't know, 200 data sets being deposited in the last year or something.
Nice.
So, and it's tough to, and that's also the environment too, where like researchers are being asked to share data
Sure,
more and
agency
more.
stuff, yeah.
So it's not, yeah, it's not just us, but it's the environment as a whole for sure.
Thank you so much, Shahira and Corey, for joining us. And we invite you to submit some feedback on this event if you have time to do so. But thank you, Emily, for facilitating, and thank you for that lovely presentation, Shahira and Corey.
Thanks, everyone. Happy Tuesday.
Happy Tuesday. Bye.
Yeah, bye.